Sarah Martinez had always been smaller than her peers. At 5 feet 3 inches and barely 120 pounds, she looked more like a college student than a Navy medic preparing for deployment with one of the most elite fighting units in the world. The other sailors at the medical training facility often whispered behind her back, wondering how someone so petite could possibly handle the physical demands of combat medicine. The doubts followed her everywhere. During field exercises, instructors would hover nearby, ready to step in if she struggled with heavy equipment. Fellow trainees offered to carry her gear, assuming she couldn't manage the weight of medical supplies and trauma kits that each combat medic was required to transport. Even her own family had expressed concerns when she announced her decision to volunteer for forward deployment with Special Operations Forces. Sarah understood their skepticism. She had grown up as the youngest of 4 children in a family where her brothers towered over her by at least a foot each. Her father, a retired Marine, had initially tried to discourage her from joining the military altogether, suggesting she pursue nursing in a civilian hospital instead. But Sarah possessed something that couldn't be measured by physical stature: an unshakable determination and an almost supernatural calm under pressure. Her journey to this moment had begun 3 years earlier, in a small emergency room in rural Texas. Fresh out of nursing school, Sarah had been working the night shift when a multi-car accident brought in 7 critically injured patients simultaneously. While senior nurses and doctors rushed around in controlled chaos, Sarah found herself moving with methodical precision, anticipating needs before they were voiced, organizing supplies with military efficiency, and providing comfort to terrified family members between treating patients. The head of emergency medicine, Dr. Williams, pulled her aside that night. He told her she had a rare gift for emergency medicine, but more importantly, she possessed the kind of mental toughness that couldn't be taught. When Sarah mentioned she had always considered military service, Dr. Williams didn't hesitate to recommend it. He saw something in her that others missed: the ability to think clearly when everyone else was falling apart. Navy basic training proved challenging, but Sarah thrived in ways that surprised even her. While she struggled with some physical requirements, she excelled in every medical scenario thrown at her. Her test scores in emergency trauma care were consistently perfect. During simulated combat situations, other recruits looked to her for guidance, despite her junior rank and diminutive appearance. The real test came during advanced combat medic training. Sarah was assigned to a unit preparing for deployment to one of the most dangerous regions in Afghanistan. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, made no effort to hide his reservations about having such a small medic attached to his team. During their first meeting, he questioned whether she could carry a wounded soldier to safety or perform medical procedures while under enemy fire. Sarah's response was simple and direct. She asked for the opportunity to prove herself during training exercises before making any final judgments. Hayes agreed, but his expression made it clear he expected her to request a transfer to a safer assignment within days. The training facility in Virginia became Sarah's proving ground. Day after day, she carried the same equipment as her male counterparts, sometimes struggling but never asking for help. She practiced medical procedures until her hands moved automatically, even in complete darkness. During simulated ambushes, while others dove for cover, Sarah would immediately begin triaging casualties, her voice steady as she called out treatment priorities. One particular exercise changed everything. The scenario involved a helicopter crash with multiple casualties scattered across difficult terrain. Sarah's team had to navigate through dense woods while carrying wounded mannequins to a designated landing zone. Other medics focused on treating the most obviously injured first. But Sarah quickly realized that some casualties who appeared less critical were actually in more immediate danger. She made rapid decisions that seemed counterintuitive to observers. Instead of working on a mannequin with obvious chest wounds, she prioritized one that showed signs of internal bleeding that others had missed. Her assessment proved correct when instructors revealed the intended survival rates for each casualty. Sarah had identified the treatment priorities perfectly, while several other medics had inadvertently killed patients by focusing on more dramatic but less life-threatening injuries. Lieutenant Commander Hayes watched the exercise from a command post, communicating with instructors via radio. As Sarah moved efficiently between casualties, directing other team members and maintaining constant awareness of her surroundings, Hayes found his preconceptions being challenged. This small woman was outperforming medics with twice her physical strength and years more experience. The final training exercise was designed to be the ultimate test. Teams would face multiple challenges simultaneously: treating casualties while under simulated enemy fire, evacuating wounded through obstacle courses that required significant physical strength, and making life-or-death medical decisions with limited supplies and time pressure. Sarah's team drew the most difficult scenario. They had to extract 3 wounded soldiers from a crashed vehicle while under attack, perform emergency surgery in a makeshift field hospital, then carry all casualties across 2 miles of rough terrain to reach an evacuation point. The exercise was designed to push even the strongest teams to their limits. As her team prepared for the exercise, Sarah could see doubt in her teammates' eyes. They had worked with her for weeks and respected her medical skills, but this challenge would require pure physical endurance. Several team members quietly discussed contingency plans for carrying her equipment if she couldn't manage the full load. Sarah said nothing as she double-checked her gear. She had trained for this moment her entire career. Every doubt, every whispered comment, every raised eyebrow had led to this point. She knew that performance in training would determine not only her future assignments, but also whether other women like her would get similar opportunities. The exercise began at dawn, with instructors firing blank ammunition and setting off controlled explosions to simulate a combat environment. Sarah's team moved toward their objective with practiced coordination, but everyone knew the real challenge would come once they had casualties to evacuate and miles of difficult terrain ahead of them. As they approached the simulated crash site, Sarah felt the familiar calm that always settled over her in emergency situations. Her breathing steadied. Her vision seemed to sharpen, and the chaos around her became manageable components of a complex problem that needed solving. She had no idea that in just a few hours, she would face a situation that would redefine everyone's understanding of what it meant to be strong enough for combat medicine. The training exercise that morning seemed routine until everything went wrong at once. Sarah's team had successfully extracted the 3 simulated casualties from the crashed vehicle and established their field treatment area when the first real emergency occurred. Petty Officer Jackson, one of the instructors playing an enemy combatant, suddenly collapsed during what should have been routine blank fire simulation. The sound Jackson made when he hit the ground was different from the controlled falls they had practiced hundreds of times. Sarah heard it immediately, even over the continuing sound effects of the exercise. While other team members maintained their focus on the training scenario, Sarah broke protocol and rushed toward Jackson's position. She found him unconscious, his breathing shallow and his skin pale and clammy. The blank ammunition and simulation equipment scattered around him told a story she recognized immediately from her emergency room experience. Jackson was having a severe allergic reaction, likely to something in the smoke effects being used for the exercise. His throat was swelling, cutting off his airway, and his blood pressure was dropping rapidly. Without hesitation, Sarah shouted for the exercise to stop and began emergency treatment. Other team members initially thought this was part of the simulation, but the urgency in Sarah's voice quickly convinced them otherwise. She called for her medical kit while simultaneously checking Jackson's vitals and assessing his condition. The nearest hospital was 25 minutes away by ambulance, but Jackson needed treatment immediately. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she prepared an epinephrine injection, established an IV line, and administered emergency medications. Her voice remained calm as she radioed for medical evacuation while continuing treatment. Lieutenant Commander Hayes arrived at the scene within minutes, expecting to find a training accident that would require basic first aid and paperwork. Instead, he discovered Sarah performing advanced emergency medicine with the kind of confidence and skill he had rarely seen outside of actual combat situations. Jackson's color was already improving, his breathing becoming more regular as Sarah's treatment took effect. The helicopter evacuation arrived 12 minutes after Sarah's initial call. As paramedics took over Jackson's care, they questioned her about the treatment she had provided. When she rattled off the medications, dosages, and timeline of her interventions, they exchanged glances of professional respect. Her emergency care had been textbook perfect, possibly saving Jackson's life. Hayes watched as Sarah calmly cleaned her equipment and prepared to resume the training exercise, as if nothing unusual had happened. When he asked her about the incident, she simply stated that Jackson had shown signs of anaphylactic shock and required immediate treatment. Her matter-of-fact attitude impressed him more than any dramatic speeches about duty or training could have. The real revelation came when Hayes reviewed the timeline of Sarah's response. From the moment Jackson collapsed to her first emergency intervention, had taken less than 30 seconds. She had recognized a life-threatening condition, made accurate diagnostic decisions, and begun appropriate treatment faster than most emergency room physicians could have managed in ideal conditions. But what truly amazed Hayes was what happened next. After Jackson was evacuated and medical personnel cleared the training area, Sarah asked if they could resume the exercise. She pointed out that her team had invested significant preparation time and that the lost training opportunity would affect everyone's readiness scores. Hayes initially assumed she was making a joke, but Sarah's expression indicated she was completely serious. The other team members supported Sarah's request. They had witnessed her emergency response and were eager to see how she would perform in the remainder of the exercise. Hayes agreed, partly out of curiosity, and partly because Sarah's calm professionalism had impressed him enough that he wanted to see what else she might be capable of. The resumed exercise presented Sarah's team with their original challenge: evacuate 3 casualties across 2 miles of rough terrain while maintaining combat readiness. What had seemed like an impossible task for someone of Sarah's physical stature now carried additional weight. Everyone present had just witnessed her save a real life under pressure. The question remained whether she could combine that medical expertise with the physical demands of combat evacuation. Sarah's approach to the evacuation revealed strategic thinking that her teammates hadn't expected. Instead of trying to match the brute strength methods used by larger team members, she developed a system that maximized efficiency while minimizing energy expenditure. She rigged carrying systems that distributed weight more evenly and established a rotation schedule that allowed team members to maintain their strength over the long distance. More importantly, Sarah maintained constant medical monitoring of all 3 casualties throughout the evacuation. While other teams focused primarily on speed and distance, Sarah's team ensured that their patients remained stable during transport. She identified and treated complications that developed during the evacuation, something that other teams missed entirely in their focus on reaching the extraction point. The 2-mile journey took Sarah's team slightly longer than some others, but they arrived at the extraction point with all 3 casualties in better condition than when they started. Medical evaluators noted that Sarah had continued advanced treatment during the evacuation, performing procedures that were typically done only in stationary medical facilities. Hayes observed the entire evacuation from various positions along the route. He watched Sarah navigate difficult terrain while carrying a full medical load, coordinate her team's movement, and provide continuous patient care. Her physical limitations were obvious, but her tactical intelligence and medical expertise more than compensated for any lack of raw strength. The exercise concluded with a detailed debrief where each team's performance was analyzed. When Sarah's turn came, the lead instructor struggled to find appropriate categories for evaluation. Her team had posted average times for distance and speed, but their patient care scores were the highest recorded in the exercise's history. More significantly, they were the only team to identify and treat complications that developed during evacuation. Hayes requested a private meeting with Sarah after the debrief. He admitted that his initial assessment of her capabilities had been based on outdated assumptions about the requirements for combat medicine. The day's events had demonstrated that technical expertise and tactical thinking were often more valuable than physical strength alone. Sarah's response surprised Hayes once again. She didn't express satisfaction at proving herself or resentment about the initial skepticism she had faced. Instead, she asked about deployment schedules and whether her performance had qualified her for forward assignment with special operations units. Her focus remained entirely on the mission and her role in supporting combat operations. The conversation concluded with Hayes informing Sarah that she would be recommended for deployment with one of the most elite SEAL teams scheduled for overseas assignment. The recommendation carried significant weight, as Hayes was known for his conservative approach to personnel assignments and his unwillingness to compromise operational effectiveness for any reason. As Sarah left the meeting, she had no way of knowing that in less than 6 months, she would face a situation where everything she had learned and proven would be tested under the most extreme circumstances possible. The skills and confidence she had developed during training would soon determine not only her own survival, but the lives of 3 Navy SEALs who would depend entirely on her ability to perform miracles under fire. 6 months later, Sarah found herself in a forward operating base in Afghanistan that felt like another planet compared to the training facilities in Virginia. The base, designated Fob Sentinel, sat on a rocky plateau surrounded by mountains that seemed to touch the sky. The constant wind carried dust that got into everything, and the thin air at high altitude made even simple tasks more challenging than they should have been. SEAL Team 7 had been operating from a Fob Sentinel for 2 months when Sarah arrived as their new combat medic. The team consisted of 12 highly trained operators, each with multiple deployments and combat experience that Sarah could hardly imagine. Their previous medic had been injured in an improvised explosive device attack and evacuated back to the United States, leaving the team without medical support during some of their most dangerous missions. The team leader, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, greeted Sarah with professional courtesy but obvious skepticism. Rodriguez was a 15-year veteran who had served with dozens of medics throughout his career. He had specifically requested a replacement with significant combat experience and physical capabilities that could match the team's operational requirements. Instead, he received a relatively inexperienced medic who looked like she belonged in a college library rather than a combat zone. The other team members were polite but distant during Sarah's first weeks at the base. They had developed tight bonds through shared dangers and experiences that she couldn't fully understand without having been there herself. Sarah knew that earning their trust would require more than medical credentials or training performance. She would need to prove herself in actual combat situations, where mistakes could cost lives. Her first opportunity came during a routine patrol in a valley that local intelligence sources claimed was free of enemy activity. The patrol was designed to establish relationships with local village leaders and gather information about potential threats in the region. For Sarah, it represented a chance to experience real combat conditions without the extreme danger that characterized the team's primary missions. The patrol began before dawn, with 12 SEALs and Sarah moving through terrain that shifted between rocky paths and agricultural fields. Sarah carried her standard medical equipment, plus additional supplies requested by Rodriguez, who wanted to ensure she could handle extended operations without resupply. The weight was significant, but Sarah had trained extensively with similar loads and managed to maintain the team's pace without difficulty. 3 hours into the patrol, they reached a small village where local leaders had agreed to meet with American forces. The meeting proceeded normally, with Rodriguez and his interpreter discussing security concerns while other team members maintained defensive positions around the village perimeter. Sarah used the time to establish a temporary medical station and treat minor ailments for villagers who requested help. The attack came without warning. One moment Sarah was treating an elderly woman's infected wound, and the next moment gunfire erupted from multiple positions in the surrounding hills. The distinctive sound of AK-47 rifles mixed with the deeper reports of heavier weapons, creating a cacophony that seemed to come from every direction at once. Rodriguez immediately began coordinating defensive positions while calling for air support and evacuation assistance. The team moved with practiced efficiency, establishing fields of fire and identifying enemy positions. Sarah found herself pressed against a mud brick wall, heart racing as she tried to process what was happening around her. The first casualty occurred within minutes of the initial attack. Petty Officer Thompson took a round through his left shoulder while moving between defensive positions. Sarah could see him 50 yards away, bleeding heavily but still returning fire at enemy positions. The distance between her position and Thompson's seemed impossible to cross with, bullets impacting the ground and walls around. Rodriguez spotted Sarah, hesitating, and shouted instructions that were barely audible over the gunfire. He needed her to reach Thompson and provide emergency treatment, but the direct route would expose her to fire from at least 3 enemy positions. Other team members were pinned down in their own positions and couldn't provide covering fire without exposing themselves to additional danger. Sarah's training took over as she analyzed the situation. The most direct route to Thompson was indeed impossible, but she identified an alternative path that used buildings and terrain features for concealment. The route would take longer and require her to move through areas where enemy fire was concentrated. but it offered better chances of reaching Thompson alive. Moving through combat conditions while carrying medical equipment proved to be entirely different from training simulations. The weight of her gear felt doubled under stress, and the irregular terrain that had seemed manageable during peacetime patrols became a series of obstacles that threatened to slow her progress. Worse, the sound of incoming bullets created an almost overwhelming urge to find cover and stay there. But Sarah forced herself to keep moving. She covered the distance to Thompson in sections, pausing behind cover to assess the route ahead and time her movements between periods of heavy fire. Each dash from one position to another felt like it lasted forever, though she later learned the entire journey took less than 3 minutes. Thompson was conscious, but weakening rapidly when Sarah reached him. The bullet had damaged major blood vessels in his shoulder, and he was losing blood faster than his body could compensate. Sarah immediately established pressure on the wound, while assessing his overall condition and determining what emergency treatment was required. Working on a patient while under fire presented challenges that no training had fully prepared her for. Enemy bullets continued to impact nearby walls and ground, creating concrete dust and debris that threatened to contaminate her medical equipment. The noise made it difficult to hear Thompson's breathing or heartbeat, forcing her to rely on visual indicators and touch to monitor his condition. Sarah established an IV line and administered pain medication, while applying a pressure bandage to control bleeding. Thompson remained conscious throughout the treatment, even attempting to continue firing his weapon with his uninjured arm. Sarah had to firmly instruct him to remain still while she worked, explaining that movement would worsen his injuries and complicate treatment. The firefight continued for another 20 minutes before air support arrived, and enemy forces withdrew from their positions. During that time, Sarah maintained constant care for Thompson, while also treating 2 other team members who suffered minor shrapnel wounds. She managed to move between patients by timing her movements with covering fire from other team members. When the shooting finally stopped and medical evacuation helicopters arrived, Thompson was stable and conscious. His blood loss had been controlled, and Sarah's field treatment had prevented any life-threatening complications. The helicopter medics who took over his care complimented Sarah on the quality of emergency treatment she had provided under extremely difficult conditions. Rodriguez approached Sarah as the evacuation helicopter departed. His expression had changed from skepticism to something approaching respect. He asked how she had maintained such steady hands while bullets were hitting so close to her position. Sarah's response was characteristically direct. She explained that focusing on her patient helped block out distractions and that her medical training provided structure that kept her calm under stress. The patrols returned to FOB Sentinel marked a turning point in Sarah's relationship with SEAL Team 7. Word of her performance under fire spread quickly through the small base, and team members who had been polite but distant began including her in conversations and informal activities. Thompson sent word from the hospital that Sarah's treatment had saved his shoulder function and possibly his life. But Sarah knew that one successful mission didn't make her a veteran combat medic. The team's most dangerous assignment still lay ahead, and she would need to prove herself repeatedly in situations that would make this first firefight seem routine by comparison. She had no idea that within days, she would face a situation where 3 lives would depend entirely on her ability to perform miracles that would test every skill she possessed. The mission briefing came at 0300 hours on a Tuesday morning that would change everything for Sarah and SEAL Team 7. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for multiple attacks on coalition forces, was meeting with weapons suppliers in a compound 15 miles from FOB Sentinel. The window of opportunity would be narrow, requiring a rapid insertion, target capture, and immediate extraction before enemy reinforcements could respond. Chief Rodriguez stood before a map covered in red marks indicating known enemy positions and potential threats. The compound sat in a valley surrounded by hills that provided excellent observation points for enemy forces. Worse, intelligence suggested that the target had increased security recently, possibly indicating awareness of coalition interest in his activities. Sarah listened to the briefing with growing concern. This would be her first direct action mission, significantly more dangerous than the patrol where she had treated Thompson. The team would be operating at maximum distance from friendly support, with limited options for evacuation if things went wrong. Every team member would need to perform flawlessly to ensure mission success and survival. The insertion plan called for helicopter transport to a landing zone 3 miles from the target compound, followed by approach on foot through terrain that offered minimal cover. Sarah would accompany the assault team to provide immediate medical support if casualties occurred during the operation. Her equipment load included not only standard medical supplies, but also specialized trauma gear for treating gunshot wounds and explosive injuries. Rodriguez assigned Sarah to stay close to Petty Officers Jensen, Martinez, and Brooks during the operation. These 3 operators would provide security for the command element, while the main assault team secured the compound. Sarah's position would keep her close, enough to treat casualties but far enough from the primary action to avoid unnecessary exposure to enemy fire. The helicopter flight to the insertion point took 30 minutes, through mountain valleys that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Sarah sat wedged between equipment and team members, trying to control the nervousness that threatened to overwhelm her preparation. This was what she had trained for. But the reality of heading into combat felt entirely different from any simulation or training exercise. The landing zone was a small clearing surrounded by rocky hills that blocked most moonlight. Team members moved quickly but quietly away from the helicopter, establishing security positions while Rodriguez confirmed their location and planned the route to the target. Sarah followed Martinez through terrain that seemed designed to trip anyone, carrying a heavy load in darkness. The approach to the compound took 2 hours through country that alternated between loose scree that threatened to slide underfoot and solid rock that offered no cushioning for equipment or knees. Sarah's medical pack felt heavier with each mile, but she managed to maintain the team's pace without requesting assistance or causing delays. They reached their observation position overlooking the target compound just before dawn. Through night vision equipment, Sarah could see a collection of buildings surrounded by walls that would provide excellent defensive positions for anyone inside. Multiple guards were visible, and thermal imaging suggested at least a dozen people were present in the compound. The assault began at 5545, with coordinated explosions that breached the compound walls at 2 different points. Sarah watched from her position as SEAL team members moved through the breaches with practiced efficiency, clearing buildings and securing areas with speed that seemed impossible, given the complexity of their task. Everything went wrong in the first 30 seconds. Enemy forces were more numerous and better prepared than intelligence had indicated. Instead of a small meeting, the team had stumbled into what appeared to be a significant gathering of Taliban commanders and their security personnel. Gunfire erupted from multiple buildings as enemy forces mounted a coordinated defense of the compound. Sarah heard Rodriguez calling for immediate extraction over the radio, but the helicopter pilots reported heavy ground fire that prevented them from approaching the landing zone. The team was trapped in the compound, taking casualties while facing an enemy force that significantly outnumbered them. Her radio crackled with urgent calls for medical assistance from multiple locations within the compound. Martinez, who was supposed to provide Sarah's security, took a bullet through his leg within the first minute of combat. Sarah immediately moved to his position, applying pressure to control bleeding while trying to assess how many other casualties needed treatment. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, she could hear at least 2 other team members calling for medical assistance. Treating Martinez under fire proved even more challenging than her experience with Thompson. The compound's layout created ricochets and crossfire patterns that made every position dangerous. Sarah had to work while lying flat against a wall, using her body to shield Martinez from debris while maintaining pressure on his wound. The cramped space made it nearly impossible to access her medical equipment efficiently. Brooks appeared at Sarah's position, dragging Jensen, who was unconscious with blood covering the left side of his head. Brooks had taken shrapnel in his right arm, but was still fighting effectively with his left hand. He shouted over the gunfire that Jensen had been hit by an explosion and hadn't been conscious since the blast. Sarah now had 3 casualties, including one with a potential head injury that could be fatal without immediate treatment. The tactical situation continued to deteriorate as enemy reinforcements arrived from nearby positions. Rodriguez reported that they were surrounded and running low on ammunition. The extraction helicopters remained unable to approach due to heavy ground fire, and close air support was still minutes away. Sarah realized that the casualties in her care might need to survive for an extended period, without evacuation to proper medical facilities. She made rapid decisions about treatment priorities. That would have been impossible without her emergency room experience. Martinez's leg wound, while painful and bleeding heavily, was not immediately life-threatening. Brooks could continue fighting with his injured arm if she provided basic wound care and pain management. But Jensen required immediate intervention to prevent brain injury from what appeared to be significant head trauma. Working on Jensen while gunfire continued around her position pushed Sarah's medical skills to their absolute limits. She had to establish his airway, control bleeding from scalp wounds, and monitor for signs of brain injury while lying in a space barely large enough for two people. Her hands shook from adrenaline, but her medical training provided structure that kept her focused on essential procedures. The breakthrough came when Sarah realized that Jensen's head injury, while dramatic, was primarily external bleeding from scalp lacerations. His pupils responded normally to light, and his vital signs remained stable once she controlled the bleeding. The blood covering his face and head had made the injuries appear much more severe than they actually were, but her relief was short-lived. As she finished treating Jensen's head wounds, Sarah heard Rodriguez calling her name over the radio. The assault team had taken additional casualties in the compound's main building, and the team leader needed her to leave her current patients and move to a new location, where other team members required emergency treatment. The request created an impossible situation. Martinez, Brooks, and Jensen needed continued medical monitoring and care, but other team members were apparently facing life-threatening injuries that required immediate intervention. Sarah had to choose between abandoning stable patients to treat critical casualties or staying with her current patients while other team members potentially died from lack of medical care. Her decision would determine not only the survival of individual team members but also the success of their escape from an increasingly desperate tactical situation. Sarah looked at the three men depending on her for survival, then at the compound where other teammates were fighting for their lives, and realized that everything she had learned and trained for had led to this single moment where her choices would determine who lived and who died. Sarah's decision came in a moment of clarity that cut through the chaos surrounding her. She couldn't abandon Martinez, Brooks, and Jensen, but she also couldn't ignore Rodriguez's urgent calls for medical assistance. Instead of choosing between patients, she would have to find a way to treat everyone while keeping them all alive under impossible circumstances. She quickly assessed her three current patients one more time. Martinez's bleeding was controlled and his vital signs were stable. Brooks was alert and could provide some self-care with proper instructions. Jensen was conscious now and responding appropriately to questions. None of them were in immediate danger of dying if she left them for a short period. Sarah made a decision that went against every medical protocol she had learned. She would leave her stable patients temporarily to treat the critical casualties. But first she had to ensure that Martinez, Brooks, and Jensen could maintain their own care during her absence. She gave Martinez pressure bandages and instructions for controlling any renewed bleeding. She showed Brooks how to monitor Jensen for signs of deteriorating consciousness and what to watch for in his own shrapnel wounds. Moving through the compound while carrying her medical equipment proved to be the most dangerous journey of Sarah's life. Enemy fire came from multiple directions as she ran between buildings, using walls and debris for cover. The 70-pound medical pack that had felt manageable during training now seemed impossible to carry while running at full speed across uneven ground under fire. Rodriguez's position was in the compound's main building, where the assault team had encountered the heaviest resistance. Sarah found him crouched behind an overturned table, blood soaking through his uniform from what appeared to be multiple wounds. Next to him, Petty Officer Williams lay motionless with obvious chest injuries that were filling his lungs with blood. The scene that greeted Sarah represented every combat medic's worst nightmare. She had two critical patients who both needed immediate surgical intervention, limited medical supplies, no proper facilities, and continued enemy fire that made extended medical procedures nearly impossible. Williams was drowning in his own blood, while Rodriguez was losing blood from what appeared to be abdominal wounds that could be fatal within minutes. Sarah's training took over as she made rapid assessments of both patients. Williams needed immediate airway management to prevent him from suffocating on blood in his lungs. Rodriguez required emergency surgery to control internal bleeding that her field equipment couldn't address properly. Both men would die without immediate intervention, but treating either one properly would take time that the other didn't have. She chose to work on Williams first, since his condition would kill him faster than Rodriguez's injuries. Using a procedure she had practiced hundreds of times but never performed in actual combat, Sarah inserted a tube into Williams's airway and began clearing blood from his lungs. The process required her to ignore incoming gunfire while performing delicate procedures that demanded steady hands and precise movements. Williams's condition improved dramatically once Sarah established a clear airway and drained blood from his lungs. His breathing became more regular, and his color improved from the gray pallor that indicated oxygen starvation. But she could see that Rodriguez was weakening rapidly from blood loss, and she needed to begin treatment for his abdominal wounds immediately. Rodriguez remained conscious but was clearly going into shock from internal bleeding. Sarah started an IV line and began fluid replacement while assessing the extent of his injuries. The wounds appeared to have damaged internal organs, possibly including blood vessels that were beyond her ability to repair in field conditions. She could control external bleeding and provide supportive care, but Rodriguez needed surgical intervention that was impossible in their current situation. Working on Rodriguez while Williams required constant monitoring pushed Sarah beyond anything she had experienced in training or her previous combat exposure. She found herself running between patients, checking airways and vital signs, adjusting IV medications, and trying to keep both men stable while gunfire continued. Around their position, the tactical situation grew even more desperate when Sarah heard explosions that indicated enemy forces were attempting to breach the building where she was treating casualties. Rodriguez, despite his injuries, continued trying to coordinate defensive positions while Sarah worked on him. His leadership was keeping the remaining team members organized, but he was weakening rapidly from blood loss. Sarah realized that their only chance for survival lay in getting everyone to the extraction point, but she had 5 casualties who couldn't move without assistance. Martinez, Brooks, and Jensen were stable but couldn't fight effectively. Williams and Rodriguez were critical and would need to be carried. The remaining team members were engaged in fighting that prevented them from helping with casualty evacuation. Her solution was unprecedented in special operations medicine. Sarah decided to create a mobile medical station that would allow her to treat patients while they moved toward the extraction point. She rigged carrying systems that would keep IV lines functioning during movement and prepared emergency equipment that could be used while walking or running. The plan required Sarah to coordinate medical care for 5 patients while helping to move them across dangerous terrain under fire. She would need to monitor vital signs, adjust treatments, and be ready to provide emergency intervention at any moment during the evacuation. The physical demands alone would have been challenging for someone twice her size, but Sarah also carried the knowledge that any mistake could cost multiple lives. Rodriguez initially refused to authorize the evacuation plan, arguing that it was too dangerous and that Sarah would be unable to maintain medical care while moving casualties across hostile terrain. But Sarah pointed out that staying in their current position guaranteed that all casualties would eventually die from their injuries or enemy action. The evacuation offered their only realistic chance for survival. The movement began with Sarah helping to carry Williams while monitoring his airway and breathing. Other team members carried Rodriguez and assisted Martinez, Brooks, and Jensen as they moved toward the extraction point. Sarah found herself running between casualties, checking equipment, adjusting treatments, and trying to keep everyone alive while bullets impacted around them. Each step of the evacuation presented new medical challenges. Williams's chest tube became blocked with blood clots, requiring Sarah to stop and clear it while the team took cover from enemy fire. Rodriguez's blood pressure dropped dangerously low, forcing Sarah to adjust his IV medications while they moved. Martinez's leg wound began bleeding again from the stress of movement, requiring her to reapply pressure bandages while walking. Halfway to the extraction point, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything about their situation. While checking Rodriguez's wounds during a brief rest, she realized that what appeared to be fatal internal bleeding was actually a combination of external wounds that looked much worse than they were. His condition was serious but not immediately life-threatening if she could control the bleeding and maintain his blood pressure. The revelation gave Sarah new hope for keeping everyone alive until they reached proper medical facilities. She adjusted treatments for all 5 casualties, optimizing their care for extended evacuation rather than immediate surgery. Her focus shifted from emergency intervention to sustained care that could maintain life over the time needed to reach safety. But as they approached the extraction point, Sarah could hear the sound of helicopter rotors being overwhelmed by increasing enemy fire. The extraction was going to be contested, meaning she would need to keep 5 casualties alive while the team fought its way to safety. Everything she had accomplished so far would be meaningless if she couldn't complete the evacuation successfully. The extraction point lay in a clearing 200 yards away, but enemy fire had intensified to the point where the evacuation helicopters couldn't land safely. Sarah could see the aircraft circling overhead, pilots waiting for the ground team to suppress enough enemy fire to allow a safe approach. The problem was that SEAL Team 7 had only 7 effective fighters remaining, and they were protecting 5 casualties across open ground that offered minimal cover. Sarah realized that the traditional approach to casualty evacuation wouldn't work in their current situation. Instead of waiting for the landing zone to be secured, she needed to prepare her patients for extraction while they were still under fire. This meant rigging equipment and treatments that could function during the chaos of combat, loading while ensuring that none of her casualties deteriorated. During the final phase of evacuation, her first challenge was Williams, whose chest tube required constant monitoring and could be dislodged during rapid movement to the helicopter. Sarah created a protection system using tape and padding that would keep the tube secure while allowing her to quickly check its function. She also prepared emergency backup equipment in case the primary tube failed during extraction. Rodriguez presented different problems. His blood pressure remained unstable, requiring careful monitoring of his IV medications. Sarah rigged a portable system that would allow her to adjust his treatment while he was being carried to the helicopter. She also prepared concentrated emergency medications that could be administered quickly if his condition deteriorated during the final evacuation. Martinez, Brooks, and Jensen were stable enough to move independently, but they would need support during the sprint to the landing zone. Sarah distributed pain medications and gave each man specific instructions about maintaining their own care during the extraction. She also assigned each of them backup responsibilities for monitoring the more critically injured casualties. The breakthrough in their tactical situation came when close air support finally arrived overhead. F-16 fighters began attacking enemy positions that had been directing fire at the extraction point. The airstrikes didn't eliminate all threats, but they reduced enemy fire enough that helicopter pilots were willing to attempt the evacuation. Sarah coordinated with the helicopter crew chief over radio, explaining the medical conditions of each casualty and the special requirements for their safe transport. The crew chief confirmed that the aircraft had medical equipment aboard and a flight medic who could assist with care during transport to the field hospital. This meant Sarah could focus on getting everyone to the helicopter rather than providing continued treatment during flight. The final assault on the landing zone required Sarah to run alongside her casualties while maintaining their medical care under direct enemy fire. She found herself checking IV lines and monitoring breathing while bullets impacted the ground around them. The physical demands pushed her beyond anything she had experienced, but adrenaline and training kept her moving when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Williams began having breathing difficulties 50 yards from the helicopter. Sarah had to stop and clear his airway while other team members provided covering fire around her position. The procedure took precious seconds while enemy forces adjusted their fire toward the stationary group. Sarah completed the airway clearance just as bullets began impacting close enough to spray dirt across her medical equipment. Rodriguez collapsed 20 yards from the helicopter, his blood pressure dropping to dangerous levels from the stress of rapid movement. Sarah immediately began emergency treatment, while Brooks and Martinez helped carry him the remaining distance. She managed to stabilize his condition enough for transport, but knew he would need immediate surgery once they reached the field hospital. Loading casualties into the helicopter while under fire proved to be the most intense experience of Sarah's military career. She had to ensure that each patient was properly secured, that all medical equipment remained functional, and that treatments continued without interruption while the aircraft was taking enemy fire. The helicopter crew chief assisted with loading, but Sarah remained responsible for medical decisions and patient care. Jensen, who had seemed stable throughout the evacuation, suddenly began showing signs of serious head injury as they loaded him into the helicopter. Sarah realized that his condition had been masked by adrenaline and shock, and that he had been functioning with injuries that were more severe than her initial assessment indicated. She had to begin emergency neurological treatment while the helicopter prepared for Takeoff. The helicopter departure was delayed by 30 seconds while Sarah stabilized Jensen's condition enough for flight. Those 30 seconds felt eternal as enemy fire continued to impact around the aircraft. The pilot maintained his position despite obvious danger, trusting Sarah's medical judgment about what was necessary for patient survival. His decision to wait potentially saved Jensen's life while risking the entire evacuation. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah found herself responsible for maintaining the lives of 5 critically injured men during a flight that would take 20 minutes to reach the field hospital. The aircraft's medical equipment was more advanced than her field gear, but she was working in a confined space with patients who remained unstable and potentially critical. William's breathing became irregular during flight, requiring Sarah to adjust his chest tube and provide assisted ventilation. Rodriguez's blood pressure fluctuated wildly despite IV medications, forcing her to constantly monitor his condition and adjust treatment. Jensen remained unconscious with signs of brain injury that could worsen without warning. The flight medic aboard the helicopter was experienced with combat casualties, but he had never worked with a field medic who had maintained this level of care under such extreme conditions. He assisted Sarah with monitoring equipment and medication administration, but deferred to her judgment about treatment decisions since she had been caring for these patients. Throughout their injuries and evacuation, Sarah used the flight time to document everything that had happened to each casualty. Knowing that this information would be critical for surgeons at the field hospital, she recorded times of injuries, treatments provided, medications administered, and changes in condition during evacuation. Her documentation was more detailed than most emergency room records, despite being compiled under combat conditions. As they approached the field hospital, Sarah received radio confirmation that surgical teams were standing by for all 5 casualties. The hospital had been alerted about the incoming patients and had prepared operating rooms based on her preliminary reports about injuries and treatments. Her field assessments would guide the initial surgical approach for each patient. The helicopter landing at the field hospital marked the end of Sarah's responsibility for these particular casualties, but she remained with each patient through the initial medical evaluation to ensure continuity of care. Her reports to surgical teams were precise and comprehensive, providing information that significantly improved each patient's chances for full recovery. Williams was rushed into surgery for chest injuries that proved to be serious but fully repairable. Rodriguez required abdominal surgery, but was stable enough that surgeons were optimistic about his complete recovery. Jensen needed neurosurgical evaluation, but his brain injury appeared less severe than initially feared. Martinez and Brooks required only minor surgical procedures and were expected to return to duty within weeks. As Sarah finally left the hospital after ensuring that all 5 men were receiving appropriate care, she realized that she had accomplished something unprecedented in special operations medicine. She had maintained the lives of 5 seriously injured soldiers through combat conditions, dangerous evacuation, and extended transport without losing a single patient. Her performance had exceeded every standard for combat medicine and had likely saved lives that would have been lost under normal circumstances. But Sarah's most significant achievement wasn't medical or tactical. She had proven that physical strength was less important than intelligence, training, and determination in combat medicine. Her success would change how the military evaluated medics for dangerous assignments and would open opportunities for others who might have been overlooked because of physical limitations rather than medical capabilities. The extraction point lay in a clearing 200 yards away, but enemy fire had intensified to the point where the evacuation helicopters couldn't land safely. Sarah could see the aircraft circling overhead, pilots waiting for the ground team to suppress enough enemy fire to allow a safe approach. The problem was that SEAL Team 7 had only 7 effective fighters remaining, and they were protecting 5 casualties across open ground that offered minimal cover. Sarah realized that the traditional approach to casualty evacuation wouldn't work in their current situation. Instead of waiting for the landing zone to be secured, she needed to prepare her patients for extraction while they were still under fire. This meant rigging equipment and treatments that could function during the chaos of combat, loading while ensuring that none of her casualties deteriorated. During the final phase of evacuation, her first challenge was Williams, whose chest tube required constant monitoring and could be dislodged during rapid movement to the helicopter. Sarah created a protection system using tape and padding that would keep the tube secure while allowing her to quickly check its function. She also prepared emergency backup equipment in case the primary tube failed during extraction. Rodriguez presented different problems. His blood pressure remained unstable, requiring careful monitoring of his IV medications. Sarah rigged a portable system that would allow her to adjust his treatment while he was being carried to the helicopter. She also prepared concentrated emergency medications that could be administered quickly if his condition deteriorated during the final evacuation. Martinez, Brooks, and Jensen were stable enough to move independently, but they would need support during the sprint to the landing zone. Sarah distributed pain medications and gave each man specific instructions about maintaining their own care during the extraction. She also assigned each of them backup responsibilities for monitoring the more critically injured casualties. The breakthrough in their tactical situation came when close air support finally arrived overhead. F-16 fighters began attacking enemy positions that had been directing fire at the extraction point. The airstrikes didn't eliminate all threats, but they reduced enemy fire enough that helicopter pilots were willing to attempt the evacuation. Sarah coordinated with the helicopter crew chief over radio, explaining the medical conditions of each casualty and the special requirements for their safe transport. The crew chief confirmed that the aircraft had medical equipment aboard and a flight medic who could assist with care during transport to the field hospital. This meant Sarah could focus on getting everyone to the helicopter rather than providing continued treatment during flight. The final assault on the landing zone required Sarah to run alongside her casualties while maintaining their medical care under direct enemy fire. She found herself checking IV lines and monitoring breathing, while bullets impacted the ground around them. The physical demands pushed her beyond anything she had experienced, but adrenaline and training kept her moving when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Williams began having breathing difficulties 50 yards from the helicopter. Sarah had to stop and clear his airway while other team members provided covering fire around her position. The procedure took precious seconds while enemy forces adjusted their fire toward the stationary group. Sarah completed the airway clearance just as bullets began impacting close enough to spray dirt across her medical equipment. Rodriguez collapsed 20 yards from the helicopter, his blood pressure dropping to dangerous levels from the stress of rapid movement. Sarah immediately began emergency treatment while Brooks and Martinez helped carry him the remaining distance. She managed to stabilize his condition enough for transport, but knew he would need immediate surgery once they reached the field hospital. Loading casualties into the helicopter while under fire proved to be the most intense experience of Sarah's military career. She had to ensure that each patient was properly secured, that all medical equipment remained functional, and that treatments continued without interruption while the aircraft was taking enemy fire. The helicopter crew chief assisted with loading, but Sarah remained responsible for medical decisions and patient care. Jensen, who had seemed stable throughout the evacuation, suddenly began showing signs of serious head injury as they loaded him into the helicopter. Sarah realized that his condition had been masked by adrenaline and shock, and that he had been functioning with injuries that were more severe than her initial assessment indicated. She had to begin emergency neurological treatment while the helicopter prepared for takeoff. The helicopter departure was delayed by 30 seconds while Sarah stabilized Jensen's condition enough for flight. Those 30 seconds felt eternal as enemy fire continued to impact around the aircraft. The pilot maintained his position despite obvious danger, trusting Sarah's medical judgment about what was necessary for patient survival. His decision to wait potentially saved Jensen's life, while risking the entire evacuation. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah found herself responsible for maintaining the lives of 5 critically injured men during a flight that would take 20 minutes to reach the field hospital. The aircraft's medical equipment was more advanced than her field gear, but she was working in a confined space with patients who remained unstable and potentially critical. Williams's breathing became irregular during flight, requiring Sarah to adjust his chest tube and provide assisted ventilation. Rodriguez's blood pressure fluctuated wildly despite IV medications, forcing her to constantly monitor his condition and adjust treatment. Jensen remained unconscious with signs of brain injury that could worsen without warning. The flight medic aboard the helicopter was experienced with combat casualties, but he had never worked with a field medic who had maintained this level of care under such extreme conditions. He assisted Sarah with monitoring equipment and medication administration, but deferred to her judgment about treatment decisions. Since she had been caring for these patients throughout their injuries and evacuation, Sarah used the flight time to document everything that had happened to each casualty. Knowing that this information would be critical for surgeons at the field hospital, she recorded times of injuries, treatments provided, medications administered, and changes in condition during evacuation. Her documentation was more detailed than most emergency room records, despite being compiled under combat conditions. As they approached the field hospital, Sarah received radio confirmation that surgical teams were standing by for all 5 casualties. The hospital had been alerted about the incoming patients and had prepared operating rooms based on her preliminary reports about injuries and treatments. Her field assessments would guide the initial surgical approach for each patient. The helicopter landing at the field hospital marked the end of Sarah's responsibility for these particular casualties, but she remained with each patient through the initial medical evaluation to ensure continuity of care. Her reports to surgical teams were precise and comprehensive, providing information that significantly improved each patient's chances for full recovery. Williams was rushed into surgery for chest injuries that proved to be serious but fully repairable. Rodriguez required abdominal surgery but was stable enough that surgeons were optimistic about his complete recovery. Jensen needed neurosurgical evaluation, but his brain injury appeared less severe than initially feared. Martinez and Brooks required only minor surgical procedures and were expected to return to duty within weeks. As Sarah finally left the hospital, after ensuring that all 5 men were receiving appropriate care, she realized that she had accomplished something unprecedented in special operations medicine. She had maintained the lives of 5 seriously injured soldiers through combat conditions, dangerous evacuation, and extended transport without losing a single patient. Her performance had exceeded every standard for combat medicine and had likely saved lives that would have been lost under normal circumstances. But Sarah's most significant achievement wasn't medical or tactical. She had proven that physical strength was less important than intelligence, training, and determination in combat medicine. Her success would change how the military evaluated medics for dangerous assignments and would open opportunities for others who might have been overlooked because of physical limitations rather than medical capabilities.